Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you are all doing well. I am Travis Giffen, the Assistant Director of Online Programs, and we are excited to have you all here to join us in the next presentation in our Emerging Scholars Series featuring Dr. Darrell Sampson, recent graduate here from the College of Education at the University of Illinois. We're very happy to have him here today. We have a quick poll to get some feedback from current students. If you are a current student, if you could give us some feedback on your interest in extracurricular events. If you're not a student, please feel free to abstain from giving us your feedback. Just two quick questions here as we get started. After folks have a moment to give us some feedback here on that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Sampson. While everybody is doing that, I just want to briefly introduce Dr. Sampson. He's a K-12 educator, leader focused in equity, student services, social and emotional wellness, and post-secondary success. He currently serves as a district student services administrator for a school in Northern Virginia. Darrell regularly presents at national, state, and local professional development conferences and collaborates with the Virginia State Department of Education in areas such as suicide prevention and LGBTQ supports for students. He has his doctorate in education policy, organization, and leadership with a concentration in diversity and equity in education here from the University of Urbana-Champaign. He also holds degrees and certificates and endorsements from University of Virginia, George Washington University, and University of Oklahoma, and University of Millikan, just down the road from us here in Illinois. Additionally, he is licensed as a licensed professional counselor in Commonwealth of Virginia. Darrell's core expertise includes education policy leadership, LGBTQ issues, grief and loss, and academic advisement. With all of that said, I've taken up enough time. Thank you for the feedback on the poll here. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Sampson.
Great, thank you so much, Travis, for that introduction. And I'm really excited to have an opportunity today to try to give back a little bit to a program that I certainly felt gave a lot to me over the 4 years that I was a doctoral student with the University of Illinois. So as Travis shared, my name is Dr. Darrell Sampson. I am an executive director of student services with Arlington Public Schools, so just across the river from the District of Columbia in DC. So with that, I'm going to dive into the research that I did while I was at the university, really trying to look at the experiences of our elementary aged transgender students in school. So when we think about why this particular topic, there are a couple of reasons, and I'll talk in a couple of slides about there's a real gap in the research literature in our understanding of our younger students who identify as transgen and what that means in the school context. Additionally, and I think many people on this call are aware of this, there's a lot of prominence right now in politics and the media about our transgender youth. So on one hand, we really see a lot of prominence with certain trans figures in the media. So you've got Laverne Cox, who's out there. You've had Jazz Jennings for a number of years. And, there are several, non-binary characters on shows such as Star Trek. And you juxtapose that. So we see these folks in the media being present and visible in ways that we haven't seen before. And then you also have, though, really high levels of violence that can be committed against transgender individuals. So even back in 2021, there were 51 trans individuals murdered or shot. And the majority of them were primarily trans individuals of color. And you couple that then with this policy landscape around the country where we have laws that are limiting bathroom access and athletic access. And we're, in some states, they're preventing educational professionals from having conversations with students about things like gender identity without automatically triggering then a parental notification. And it's the right time to understand, in my perspective, what does all of that mean to our students? So I want to preface this by saying, what do I mean when I talk about, the term transgender? So in my research, really, we're talking about transgender as encompassing any person or individual whose gender identity is something other than cisgender. Cisgender is my gender identity, and the sex assigned at birth that I have correspond. Transgender is sort of everything, a situation where my gender identity does not correspond to my sex assigned at birth. So that can include people who identify as non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, gender non-conforming. I'll use that term transgender, but I'm really talking about all of those different identities and beyond when I use it. So, click that again. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about what does the research literature tell us about trans individuals and schooling. So there has been a pretty solid bank of research over 20 years using a variety of data sources that focuses really on this LGBTQ group of students, this big umbrella. But as we've learned, that LGBTQ umbrella encompasses a lot of different identities that engage with the world, engage with school staff, engage with peers in different ways. So there's a real gap in a lot of that literature on a transgender student specific focus. Then when we do try to look at the research around transgender students, we find a lot of the same risk factors as our LGBTQ students. So, risk factors for LGBTQ youth in general are around mental health challenges, attendance issues, grades, post-secondary aims and aspirations, also a lot of harassment and victimization. We find all of that with our transgender students, but we also find additional struggles with basic needs such as access to healthcare, and they're much more likely to change schools trying to find a program that will be supportive of who they are in their gender identity. For both LGBTQ students and transgender students, we also know a lot about things that work. So we know that having gender inclusive curriculum, we know that schools having a gender sexuality alliance, they used to be known as gay straight alliances, having that can be really helpful. Inclusive policies, so the non-discrimination policies, bullying prevention policies, and even other policies help to reduce those risk factors. And then having supportive adults also helps to lessen some of these risks that come with identifying as LGBTQ, but in particular, identifying as transgender. The gap though, really, even when we look at research that focuses specifically on transgender students, is that these studies are all done on older students. High school, for the most part, there's of course a lot of literature about transgender identifying students at the university and collegiate level. But there's really not a lot of information about our elementary transgender students. There's some, but these studies tend to focus really on how these younger students are forming these identities, about how they are making decisions about transitioning. Or what we see a lot of is that the studies are focused on the parents or the teachers and sort of their perceptions of what the children are going through, and how are they, as the adults in this scenario, really trying to help the kid and come to terms, with their own professional practice or their parental guidance. There's almost no inclusion in any literature about our elementary students that has student-specific voices. And beyond that, we really don't have a lot on how do our elementary school students fare within sort of that K through 12 educational setting. So that was really sort of the research gap that I saw when I was considering my study. So given all of that, I really formulated research questions around how do trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming elementary age students experience and navigate schooling in a mid-Atlantic state? What do these students reveal as their support systems? And then what do they identify as barriers? So the study really ended up being a qualitative, descriptive, or a basic qualitative study. So the goal really there was to understand the experience of the students, how they construct their world, and then how they make meaning of all of these day-to-day interactions at school with peers, with staff, and then staff maybe even not in the school, but people like bus drivers. Really focused on this mid-Atlantic state setting because this was a state where schools were in the process of being mandated to adopt policies consistent with a state model policy that was supportive, highly supportive, and highly based in evidence and research-based practices specific to our transgender students. And I'll talk about the participant selection process in a little bit, but really, ended up with two sets of participants here. So I had two sets that were white identified, and we had Alexis, who used she, her pronouns, and her parent, Jennifer. And they really lived in suburban area, and Alexis was in 5th grade. And then we had Emma, who used ze pronouns, and their mother, Penelope. And Emma was in a rural part of the mid-Atlantic state and was in 4th grade. So in terms of the framework that I used, sort of what was my theoretical framework, was queer theory. And a couple of points there. So queer theory really starts from this place that gender is a socially constructed identity. And gender is really limitless. Everybody's expression of gender and everyone's experience of gender is unique. And really, if we think about that, that's true for any one of us, whether or not we identify as cisgender, whether or not we identify on the binary as male or female, or whether we identify all along various and sundry continuums that may or may not even be linear. And then really the theory talks about exploring those people who are specifically at the margins of the gender identity mainstream and redefining then what gender and sexuality can be. The goal here is to really break down these strict gender and sexuality binaries that we have, at least in modern Western society, and potentially to create sort of a new understanding of what this idea even of normal and gender really mean. And then we're really trying to examine the power. Who has the power, when we think about gender and gender identity, who holds it? And then the queer theoretical framework really it's a theory of action. So how are we taking action as part of being membership in sort of this, gender and sexuality community? How can we use research as a way to support action or take action to try to, really expand this concept of gender? And so all of these things really help to focus the analysis. So what am I looking for when I'm looking at findings? Is I was really trying to look at sort of these themes around power, themes around like how we understand and identify gender, how the students came to those conclusions for themselves. And then trying to, through research and through the findings, help people to better understand what those experiences are like, so that maybe it can expand people's understanding of what gender expression and gender identity are, for themselves, for their communities as well. So a big part of certainly qualitative research is you have to think about your positionality, because that position is interacting on a regular basis with your research subjects, with your analysis, with the writing and the word choices that you will use as you are trying to take the voices of the people that you've interviewed, or the items that you're using as part of your research, and then make sense and meaning of them as part of your research. So certainly for me, in terms of like the inside status, is I am a member of the LGBTQ community, identify as a cisgender gay man. But when it came to the trans specific community, and more importantly, when we're talking about young children, the trans family spaces, I was not an insider. And I really, as I went through this journey of this research, had to really think about and separate sort of my experiences growing up as a gay individual in the Midwest versus what these young elementary aged students who identify as trans, non-binary, and gender fluid, how that could be very different than their experiences, and certainly different as part of their families' experiences. When it comes to the getting entrance into that community, it's really challenging. We're thinking about a group of students and families who, in many ways, are at the margins of society and deal with a lot of adversity on a daily basis. And so that in and of itself makes those parents, I think, very protective of their kids and wanting to sort of keep that community tight and together. So, I had connections to start to, get information to those spaces, but because I wasn't a member of those spaces, I think there were some challenges in being able to recruit participants. And then, I really wanted to make sure that because of that, I was highlighting their voices in the findings and trying to keep my own perspective out of it as much as I possibly could. And really, when it comes to positionality and you're trying to make sure that you're reflecting their voices to the extent any of us can, really trying to use the researcher journal, those analytic memos, constant reflections, and detailed description as part of the structure of the findings as much as I possibly could. So then when we think about the findings, and I'd done interviews with the students, I did interviews with their parents so that I had some ability to compare data. I pulled that together, did coding to try to pull out the major themes. So these were the, major findings and themes, and I'll go into more specifics. But, I think a large overarching thing that came out of it was this idea of adapting, and whether the student has to be the one to adapt to the school because of their identity, or whether we in education have to think about schools and the systems of schools trying to better adapt to meet the needs of all students, of which transgender students are but one particular group. So a lot of that information came out in these three themes, which were into their internal experiences of school, school practices, so those items that are really under school control that both help and hinder students, and then non-school support. So focus on the environments and factors outside of the school day that really influence how that student goes into school and is able to navigate. So when we think about the internal experiences of school, there are really two categories within that theme and several subcategories. So the idea of exhaustion and tokenism. So students really felt like they were the main educator and resource for their schools about gender identity. And we're talking about a 4th and a 5th grade child here. That they very clearly verbalized was exhausting to them at times, frustrating to constantly have to be on and to explain who they were and justify in many situations who they were. The main driver really of their identity development was them seeing or hearing something that connected with them. So in one case, really, it was in the case of Emma, it was a book that Z had been reading with Z's parent. And when Emma saw something about non-binary students, there was an immediate connection for Emma, and how that word and that term really clicked with Zir as Zir identity. Like that was suddenly like, okay, now I get who I have been all this time. Their peers really could be immensely supportive in relieving that exhaustion. So if they had a friend who understood, they weren't always the ones that had to be educating society, but then there are also peers in their buildings that really added to their burden, that said things that were unkind or asked questions, or, and we'll look at an example, you know, at some point here, which really is their identity has been denied by a peer. And then they really think a lot about how and when to tell people. So the timing of their disclosure to schools really mattered, because they wanted to have established friendships and support systems before they then disclosed to their class or to the larger school community. Additionally, there's really this sub-theme of self-knowledge and growth. These students were extremely self-aware. They knew themselves well, they knew their identities, they knew who they were when they interacted with various and sundry stakeholder groups. And the advocacy, advocacy and taking action was something that helped develop a sense of purpose and built their self-worth. But because they could go to things like speak at board meetings, or speak with administrators in a meeting about them and advocate for other transgender students, that gave them hope and meaning and purpose. And then all of these students really tried to own this experience for themselves. Even if, 4th and 5th grade, they would keep things sometimes from their parents because they didn't want their parents to worry about them. They wanted to keep it to themselves. In both, sets of interviews, there were things that the students disclosed as part of those interviews that the parents were not aware of. And I didn't mention this before, but because I was working with, minors, I was happy to have the parents be part of the interviews with the students. And then I also met with the parents later. So the parents had that opportunity to reflect upon what their students were saying. And again, they found things out that they'd never known had the impact on their child, as the child then expressed. So one of the quotes here is really from Alexis, and sort of this idea of exhaustion, in terms of it feels like they are the teacher trying to tell these stories over and over and over again, because nobody else gets these terms. The 4th grader is the one who really has to teach their adult teacher, who has a lot of training, what it even is to be trans. And then Emma really talks about how it's frustrating. You change classes, you change grade levels, you change schools, and you have to then go about this whole process of re-education over and over and over again. So this is one really where the peers are having, denying their identity. So in this situation, Alexis was, denied by a student their opportunity to say, hey, I'm trans. This other student says, I need to go ask the bus patrol. And the bus patrol says, well, no, that's not possible. Alexis is not a girl. And versus allowing Alexis to define who she is for her peers. So, that again, I think sends that message of, you don't belong here, you don't fit in here, in the school or within the rest of our peer group. So the second major theme is really around school practices. So we have 3 main categories here. So education and training. So school staff, I think, really for these students and families came from a reactive stance versus having put any preventative measures or thought through, what school could be like for a trans kid. And so sometimes it was suddenly like, let's hurry up and try to put something in place versus, oh, you're trans? Okay, this is what we can do and how we can support you. The students really, wanted there to be opportunities for staff to have received some training on trans issues. Again, I think this would help alleviate for them, this idea of we always have to be the ones educating. And then the students also really felt strongly about there needing to be an opportunity for there to be like an LGBTQ class for their peers, so that they, again, were not left with the burden of always having to educate the other students within their class. And I think that's really interesting, in lieu of all of these pieces of legislation out there, in that these kids really would feel that they would benefit from having these discussions at the elementary level, so that it would be easier for other students to understand, when they say they are X, they're trans, they're non-binary, that they wouldn't have to go into as much explanation because their peers would simply understand it because they had already been given that information. The second, major category here is really this idea of fulfilling the promise of policy. And I think we know in education that there can often be a disconnect between what policy says and then how it is implemented and practiced. So even in one school, Alexis was in a school district that had a pretty explicit policy about how to support transgender individuals. But then what Alexis experienced, and there's an example on the next slide, was very different than that. So even though a district may have an inclusive and supportive policy, doesn't mean that the individual actors within the school are following it either within the spirit or even to the letter. And then they talked a lot about what works best for them. So what are things that schools do that have helped them? So thinking about careful student placement. So making sure that a student is in a class with a teacher that'll be supportive, making sure that student is in a class with peers with whom they connect, and really making sure that these students are called by the correct name and pronoun, because again, that shows that you matter, you're here, I see you. And then really removing physical and pedagogical barriers, such as these idea of gender groupings, where we say all the boys line up over here and all the girls line up over here. There are other ways that we can group students. Do we have to have things like family life education done in ways where we separate the kids by gender? Isn't that something that would be beneficial for all students to know and understand? And then really another piece was that there were resources in the school, such as books, educated personnel, such as school counselors, that would be available as additional supports for students. And here you have a quote really from Jennifer, and this is Alexis's mother. And the principal had said in a meeting, well, you do have the right to use whatever bathroom you choose, really, and because of the policy Alexis did, but then share that my perspective as a principal is that I would prefer you didn't, so you don't get teased or people don't have questions, okay? And what happens in these situations is that then these kids don't use the bathroom. And I've come across this not only in this research project, but also in my day job. And, we have students who, like Jennifer's describing here, will run home from the bus stop and just jet immediately for the bathroom. And it's because they didn't use it at all at school because they didn't feel comfortable. They don't fit within the boys' restroom. They're not allowed to use the girls' restroom. And then they feel sort of, ostracized, or like it may not even be close, that they can't use, a unisex or an individualized bathroom. And Jennifer, commented like, I don't even know if Alexis was drinking water at all or drinking anything during the day because of that. And I think that's pretty powerful. Those kinds of words and those kinds of decisions that we make for kids and setting up these barriers can have some real health implications. And then here, Emma is talking about how, other kids could bring in things for show and tell, but anytime that Emma wanted to bring in something, Zir was not allowed to have something that was considered queer, like the teacher would never call on Emma, and because Emma felt like it was that Zir was not able to say things about trans and celebrate in many ways who Emma was. I think that's really where it gets down to, is that if every other kid is allowed to bring something in about show and tell and share it, and Z is not able to bring in something that is important to them and share it, what kind of message does that send them? And to any other student, with a different identity within that classroom or that school. And then the last theme really had these two categories, and it's these non-school supports. So, both of these students had really fierce, passionate parent advocates who spoke up for their children and tried to relieve their burdens and who went to bat for them time and time again. But I think it's really important to know that the parents also had a lot of fear for their children. And we'll look at a slide in a minute, and fear for themselves and their families because of having a trans child. Every day they send their kids to school and hope that their kid is okay and going to be safe in communities that they aren't always convinced are going to be safe, and that everyone in there will look out for their child. And then the last, category is really around finding your people. And this was really an interesting one for me, because in talking to them, I wasn't anticipating how much these outside groups, these outside organizations, and Emma went to a camp, and that camp gave Emma so much in terms of Zir self-esteem, in terms of Zir ability to advocate for herself. It was a powerful way for these students to connect with the broader community and to feel empowered by their identities. So here really Penelope is talking about, that she had Emma go and speak in front of the school board as these boards are trying to adopt policies and having lots of debates about them. And really, Penelope was very proud of Emma. And this was something that Emma wanted to do. This wasn't something where, the parent, said, you're going to do this. Emma was excited about it. But then the family got threats, they got doxxed, calls were made to Child Protective Services for supporting their non-binary student. And, it really, from the parents' perspective, put that student at risk, really was concerning to them. And it put not only their student, but, that family had other children in the home, and themselves as adults. So here then, Emma is talking about their experience with this Pride camp, this camp that they went to over the summer, where they were able to engage with other queer people, and made them feel less alone. I think for trans kids, particularly if you're in a small elementary school community, you might be the only one about which you're aware if you're in a school of 100 to 200 kids. And really, it's these outside community groups that, or camps in this case, that really helped them to feel connected, like they weren't alone, that they, had people that had their back, that they could build some of these skills and learn how to advocate for themselves, because they had a group of people that were also advocating for them. So I think then out of these findings, really a couple of items came out, which is really that, as much progress as maybe we think we've made, schools are still very much heteronormative and cisnormative spaces. We have so much that is, whether it's media, whether it's the terms that we use, prom king, queen, or whether we're, telling people, you're calling students by boys versus girls in terms of ways we divide students. we really still reinforce on a regular basis, heterosexuality and cisnormativity. And any time one of these families or these students really tried to challenge this, as things we know about systems can be resistant to change. Like there really is resistance to, trying to change the entire structure of a school or how we think about things like restroom access to a universal design model. We really resist that. We have a lot of reasons why we say we can't do those things. And then schools really maintained the marginalization of these students. So even if I would say, a school is able to say, okay, student, we're gonna, do this for you, and you're gonna be able to use these restrooms, and this is gonna be fine. They still have to go through a process by which they have to, meet with people and get a plan pulled together, and we need to involve, parents and families in all of these discussions, and we have to think about records. But all of that continues to, in some ways, still separate out these kids as different from their peers, their cisgender peers, and there's some examples really where, Alexis is in class and the teacher is really excited and comes and talks to Alexis about this idea of two-spirit because they're studying Native Americans. And the teacher talks about that with Alexis, but the teacher only talks about that with Alexis. The teacher doesn't talk about the concept of two-spirit with the rest of the class. So I'm doing this for Alexis because of Alexis's gender identity, but it's not something that the rest of the class needs to have an understanding of. And then the teacher for Emma was very supportive, but that teacher was only allowed to use Emma's pronouns, sie and zir, in private or in correspondence to their house, but they couldn't use it in front of the class. They couldn't use the pronouns in class. So again, I can use them outside of class, but the space that is class is only going to be a space that is really, grounded in sort of this cisnormativity. And then finally, really, it's this role of action. Like the action and the advocacy were really keys for the parents and the students. And I think that's true for many of us. If we, feel something, is wrong, like we feel empowered when we try to do something about it. And I think that that was really powerful for both the parents and the students to be engaged in advocacy, not only for their own child, but these families and these students were also advocating for all the other, transgender students that may be within their school districts or within their schools. So in terms of recommendations for schools, it's really thinking about, we have to believe and affirm these students' identities, as they share them. That one simple piece of I see you, I understand who you are, and I affirm who you are is huge, because otherwise we're denying their right to exist within our schools and communities. We have to focus on implementation and training, not just accountability, and accountability, not simply policy making. Because really, I mean, at the end of the day, like we don't want children not using a restroom all day at school. That's not healthy from a physical health standpoint. We really need to try to actively create gender neutral practices and gender neutral spaces. So there are some schools in the country that have implemented this concept of gender neutral bathrooms. And we need to, is that something that we could do more holistically across the board? And then can we group kids in ways other than gender? And how do we get that out of the elementary sort of lexicon of ways that we group students? There are a million other ways we can group students. We can give them numbers. We can do, longest hair length. We can do shoe color. We can do all kinds of things that can help to give us smaller groups of kids for whatever that need is, without having it be based solely on their gender. And gender inclusive curriculum and resources is critical, and that's borne out in a lot of the other LGBTQ and transgender research. I think this just affirms it. But making sure that we have that information available for students, and that better understanding, gender identity across the board is something that would be good for all kids, so that they could understand it and also then, be more supportive of their peers. And then really thinking about this idea of staff training for all, so really being proactive versus reactive. And then really we have to be inclusive of all staff, such as bus drivers. It's something that both of them talked about were, issues with some of the bus drivers. And that's not something in K-12 that we always think about when we think about broad trainings about school climate and culture issues. It's something that, maybe we remember that we really need to be involving, our front office staffs, but it's really anybody who interacts with kids in our buildings or in our districts needs to have an understanding and also needs to know what the expectations of the district are in terms of supporting and affirming these students. So in terms of future research, this was a small study, and I'll talk about that on the next slide about limitations, but we do need more studies on our elementary students, schools, and their parents. This was really exploratory in nature because there's no research literature about which I'm aware that has looked at this from the student lens before. But with any research, area, there are duplicated studies or new studies, just help to build on and either affirm or bring new or different nuances to these findings. I really thought that the finding on camps was new and interesting. I don't think I've seen a lot in the research literature about the impact of, LGBTQ or trans inclusive like spaces over time, like a residential place for kids. But we know that camps are highly impactful on students. And I think there's some additional research that could be done there to better understand what that impact is and what it means to be in a space where you don't have to worry. Everybody there is similar to you, and you don't have to have that weight on your shoulders of, oh, how are other people going to think of me or take me in when they first meet me. Peers and curriculum, there's not a lot in there about the impact of positive peer relationships. We look a lot on negative peer relationships, but do positive peer relationships or, states that have mandated curriculum, where do we have the studies on the effectiveness of that or how that benefits students? I think that would be really interesting to dive into in the future. And then when we think about gendered practices and spaces, if we create these gender neutral practices and we have these spaces, we need to start to sort of see what does the impact of those spaces, like physical spaces or practices, actually have on students. The study had several limitations. Doing research during the COVID-19 pandemic was difficult, really limited relationship building. And when you're working with a marginalized population, particularly with, children, I think that was I couldn't necessarily go out to a meeting and get to know folks and they could put their eyes to my face. And in addition, families in general were feeling a lot of overwhelm during the pandemic. So adding one more thing where I'm asking to get a couple of hours of their time to interview them and learn more about their experiences, really impacted the number of participants. Sampling and recruitment, small number. As with qualitative research, like it is, I'm a constructivist. So the reader has to determine what is applicable to their situation. I think strongly that the voices of these students and their families and the findings are important, even if it's just to understand what do younger trans students, what is it like for them in school? I think there's a lot of value in that, even if it's a small number of participants. And there are real challenges in the recruitment efforts, multiple amendments to the original IRB to try to expand the potential possibility of who would be eligible. And then a lot of reaching out for recruitment to local LGBTQ and transgender family organizations did take place. But again, when we come back to positionality, if I'm not a member of those communities, I think there are real challenges because, and rightly so, they want to be really protective of their kids. And then something for a future project, would be, this was a very homogeneous, sample. The students were white, the families were white, middle class, highly supportive parents. And that tells us about that kind of perspective and experience. But there are a lot of other experiences, trans students whose parents aren't necessarily as supportive, or, trans experience or trans students of color and their experiences could look very different than the ones that were in the study. And then in terms of reflections, I talked about earlier, there was a lot of that inner dialogue going on about insider versus outsider status, and how those were at play, not only in sort of those recruitment efforts, but then as I engaged with the data, and making sure that I did not put my own sort of lens or make a lot of assumptions about what might be shared based on my own experiences. And then it's really, the challenges I think that I sort of had were, frustrations on the sample size and getting more participants. But, I landed on it. They were really high quality and informative interviews as part of the project. It is exploratory research, and hopefully it sets up interest or a foundation for others to pick this up and continue to explore this particular group and schools in the future. And then I think, as somebody who's worked in schools my entire life, it caused me to really reflect even more about how much our systems are set up in support of sort of the heteronormative and cisnormative constructs. And, I know we've talked, there's a lot of information out there and about this concept of universal design that's really about, individuals with disabilities. But I think, we can really think about this concept of universal design, whether it's for spaces or whether it's for curriculum and pedagogy. I think we can think about that more broadly to make sure how are we being the most inclusive that we can be of all the different types of identities that students bring to us every day when they enter those school doors. And that is the conclusion of the presentation. But I will turn it over to Travis, or if I have questions, I'm happy to try to answer a few if we have time.
Yeah, we still got some time here. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I learned quite a bit. I hope others joining us today, watching this recording back, also learn a few things as well. I'm going to go ahead and open things up for questions from everybody. And then we just have one feedback poll that I'm going to run kind of at the same time here. So if you have questions about the research, about the presentation, about the program, anything like that, we got some time here. You can go ahead and type that in the chat or raise your hand. Dan, you came first, so go ahead.
Thank you. What a wonderful presentation. And it's so nice to hear about the work that you're doing for our trans students, especially younger students. In discussing your theoretical concepts, like the foundations for your study, you discussed the importance of queer theory and the way in which queer theory kind of focused your approach to the study. I'm wondering specifically if you might be able to name the queer theorists that you felt to be most important to your study in helping you kind of come up with a structure and a way to approach your inquiries.
Sure. There's a couple of things. Certainly Butler, I think, is a key there. I did read Sedgwick, because I think that's another key text, the I can't say the word, epistemology, I think, of the closet, again, is a seminal text. And part of what I did is I just started, looking at the reference lists to see who was popping up a lot as I would read articles about queer theory. Dr. Jules Gill Peterson, who I think is at Johns Hopkins now, wrote a book about the history of the transgender child, which I would sort of count in there as there's parts of it that are, I think, very well based in theory and queer theory. It's a great text. It's dense, but it's highly informative, and her analysis of the earliest records that we have in this country about trans kids, I think helps you to better understand like how this has been going on for years. And she uses a lot of theoretical constructs as part of that book that I found to be really helpful and thought-provoking about why we do things in a certain way. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the authors. There was and I'll have to think about it. There was a group of articles that I came across because, we sort of look at like Butler, and Sedgwick, and there's a couple other people. And then it's sort of this ongoing conversation between researchers about queer theory, and one, I think sort of, talks about like, is the goal really of queer theory to just blow everything up in terms of this concept of gender, or is it to, and to completely undo what we think of as gender, or is it to make more room at the table of gender for all sorts of people? And, I think, I'd have to go back and figure out who. There was really sort of this dialogue between two different researchers in multiple journals about that I found was really helpful and interesting.
Thank you so much. And then just kind of as a follow-up question too with those researchers, how do you see, because one of your recommendations is that we work to be more trans inclusive in terms of our curriculum. How do you see that theory then informing curriculum that we might see in especially like the elementary ed level?
Sure. I mean, I think there are curricula out there. I mean, if you look at HRC and Welcoming Schools, and GLSEN has some materials, there are things out there that I think are, I've been around for a while. So we've sort of gone from the binary to, I think there's more materials now that try to make it so that it's not just a binary, but it's really all sorts of ways that people can identify. There's a lot more children's literature out there that can be used, and some of it's very generalized, like read a crayon story, or neither, which isn't, I mean, there's nothing in there that says this is about gender identity, but you can look at those books and sort of pick up that really for any kind of difference, they're really strong like that. So I think that there are materials that exist out there right now where we can start to talk with kids and classrooms about what the idea of difference is, and how we need to be more inclusive of all kinds of difference. And gender identity is one of those, things where people may identify in many different ways, but that there is room for all of these people at the table. I think neither does a really good job of that. Gavin Grimm has a book out right now for elementary kids. The Jazz Jennings book is out there. There's a lot of actual, I think that what's surprising sometimes to me is the amount of literature out there for younger students that already exists. And then I think, with anything in schools, it's how do you do some explicit teaching, and then how do you build applicability of that and into the rest of the curriculum? So if we're talking about a book like Does Gender come into play in this book, that's not in any way, shape, or form about gender identity, but are we reinforcing how we think about that, when we're having a book discussion about comprehension, or how our characters feeling, thinking, and things like that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Real quick before we get to Jolene's question, Darrell, if folks are interested in your dissertation, would you be willing to share it if they reach out to you via your email here?
Sure. yeah, I keep waiting for it to be available in ideals, but I don't think it's quite there yet.
It will be soon.
Okay.
Jolene?
Hey there. First, I want to thank you for recently sharing your dissertation with me. It was a really inspiring, informative read. And I also just want to thank you as a parent of a young transgender daughter, just for doing this research and really focusing on lifting up the voices of students and their parents, because as you said, you know, there's not a lot of research out there. The question I was actually going to ask you, Dan just asked us his follow-up question with regards to curriculum and resources, because that is the direction really, you know, coming out of your recommendations around exploring, you know, inclusive curriculum. And you mentioned HRC, and just wanted to ask, you know, are there any other, I know you referenced some books, but any other organizations or agencies that you would suggest to research to find out more about like more structured curriculum and resources for schools to utilize outside of HRC's Welcoming Schools?
Sure. And again, I don't know what GLSEN, I mean, GLSEN's had materials in the past, but they would be an organization I would look at. You know, one thought I just had, and my study wasn't specific to curriculum, but you know, California mandates that there be inclusive curriculum within the state. And so that might be a place to go. I think Massachusetts does as well. I'd have to go back and confirm that, but I'm also wondering sort of at the state level, you know, what information they might be able to provide or what curricular standards they might have for schools in order to meet some of these mandates that those states have put in place. Gender Spectrum is an organization based on the West Coast that might have some resources. I don't know the curriculum has been their main, is their main bag, but they do have a lot of like resources and process documents available for schools. And they're one of their missions is really to be as supportive of the school family partnership and process as they possibly can be. So they might also be an organization that has it. There could also be a great dissertation topic for somebody if they wanted to look at these curricula. I'm just saying, Jolene.
I know I saw her on here, Dr. Lee, and I just had a conversation last week about that, so.
Right, and I think it's really, I mean, I talk about this a little bit in sort of my, you know, reflections, but I think that that's really, you know, for states like California that have implemented some of these things or mandated these things for a number of years, you know, I think a research question in my head is, well, what has been the impact of that? You know, how do we know it's done what we said for that? Oh, Dr. Lee is saying Illinois also has that mandate. What has the state created? Is it part of a university school division partnership? Is it coming out of the State Department of Education? Those might be, you know, some things to look at as well.
Thank you for the questions. With that, we're at 1. I don't know if you need to leave here real quick, Dr. Sampson, but if you have time, I have time. And if anybody wants to get in one last question, we could go ahead and do that.
And people have my email address if they want to reach out, and I'm happy to share the dissertation if that's helpful to some of you who are in this process.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation. Thanks for the great questions. It's good to see so many of you here this afternoon, at least in Illinois. It is afternoon now, so hope you all have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you at other events. Take care.
Thank you all. Take care.